Hi there, it's Doze here. This is going to be a little bit different of a topic today compared to my normal stuff that I have on here, which is just talking about my bipolar 1 disorder and the struggles that I'm typically facing with it in my day-to-day life and kind of where I'm at. So today's going to go over my father, and I'm going over this mainly because he played a pretty major part, I feel, in a lot of the things I did and how I would end up approaching the adulthood from the get-go. And more importantly, I do hope at some point somebody who needs to see this does see this and understands that if you come from a bad circumstance, it doesn't necessarily mean that life is over or that you can't fix yourself. So to pretext this, I guess I'll kind of go to chronological order as to when I was born and what would ultimately be his demise when I was 18. Starting from young adulthood, my father was kind of a confused kid, and I'm basing this based on stories he told me. He was very lost. He was picked on a lot, and he always blamed those around him for getting picked on. He didn't have a dad, which was problematic back then. It was only his mother and his brother and sister. So, single mother with 3 kids. His father had 2 families. And when his mother found out about this, she, of course, instantly divorced him and left him for good. He had been carrying on 2 marriages with 2 separate lives and 2 different last names. One was by the last name of Sexton, and another one I can't say because it's mine. It's unknown which was his real last name. No one ever figured it out, at least later down the line. However, in later court proceedings, they did proceed with Sexton as his last name, so we can presume that most likely that was his real last name, and my father was the one to receive the fake last name. His father, after being discovered he had 2 families, had went on to get into radio hosting. Apparently, he had a really good voice, and I got to listen to an old audio snippet, and he did have a very good radio voice for the time. During this, his father, for some reason, decided to turn to a life of crime. He started robbing banks. This was back in, I want to say, the early 60s. So it was a bit different. And his father got away with it for a little bit before getting caught and sent to prison. By the time he ever out, and I believe he was out on a furlough, but I have no clue. But the only time my father ever got to see him was once in his entire life. And that was when his mother brought him home from school and said, "There's your father, say what you want to him." My father never forgave. His father should have been there, that his father should have been a hero to him, but it just never happened. And he forever despised his mother for the way he was raised and for the circumstances in which he grew up dadless. He made a promise to himself from a very young age that he would have a son. That was his life goal, is he wanted a son. Later into life, he kind of got a bit more mischievous. He kept getting in trouble. At school, he'd skip. He was smoking, doing other sort of substances. He pretty much blew life to the side. He grew tired of the place he lived in, which was rural Indiana. He didn't want anything to do with it anymore. He eventually would go on to meet his first wife and have 2 female kids with her. That marriage would eventually fall through, and he would meet a pretty young girl, known as my mother, and they would hit it off pretty quickly. They both loved partying, they both loved doing just stupid things around the neighborhood, and life went on. There was a point in which my father had considered joining the military. He said he got to the point of taking the ASVAB before he decided he just can't see himself doing this. that this is just not him. This is kind of where the wholesomeness ends, and we start to see cracks into what was really going on under the surface with him. When my father first got with my mother, he had already exited his first marriage. He did not tell my mother anything about this first marriage or that he even had kids. He did not talk to his kids. He did not talk to his ex-wife. He wanted nothing to do with any of his family, and he did not share anything about his family. My father would have been either in his late 20s or early 30s, and my mother had my sister when she was 16. If that kind of tells you anything about the age gap. Because they weren't officially married yet, when my sister was born, she adopted a different last name. She adopted my mother's maiden name. And later down the line, they would get married and bring on my last name while having me. From the get-go, the situation of the relationship seemed okay. My mother had a troubled history. She was a diagnosed schizophrenic, and early childhood showed that. One notable story about my mother as a child was she had really bad OCD at the time, and this is really young into her childhood. Because it was still early on in the years, she was able to be pulled out of school permanently to take care of her household. There was 5 children, including her, along with both parents. And of course, her dad and mom worked, and they had all sorts of marital issues. And the other 4 kids were older than her and needed to go to school and were doing their own things, getting their own troubles. So eventually her dad opted to pull her out of school when she was entering middle school, and she would never return to education again. That was permanent. She would now stay at home and help take care of the house while everybody else was trying to move on with their lives. She described her father as a horrible alcoholic. He would get very violent when he was drunk, and he would absolutely take it out on the kids. Anyway, since she had really bad OCD, and she was taking care of the house all the time, her sister had this tendency to leave her clothes on the floor. My mother did not like that too much, and repeatedly informed her father that if it doesn't stop, she would make it stop. Now, of course, coming from, at the time, I think she was 9, coming from a 9-year-old, you think maybe she's gonna put markers all over her clothes or something, right? No. My mother hatched a great idea. She was gonna kill her. She proceeded to take rat poison and put it in the food. And as she was actively doing that, her father walked in and seen it and said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm making sure she doesn't leave any more dirty clothes." And oh goodness, it went down. So her father hurried up and threw away everything she just cooked and said, "You are staying with me in my sight right now." Made her sit on the couch while he went into the bedroom and screamed at her sister, saying, "She's literally trying to kill you right now because you can't pick up your clothes. Pick up your clothes." So my mother recounts that for many months she was stuck by her father's side. Like they said, she says about 8 months that she remembers never being allowed to do anything. She was stuck right there next to him so he could watch her and make sure she wasn't going to do it again. Warning signs in her childhood that there was something more at play in her head, and it was later discovered, as I said, that she was a schizophrenic. The running diagnosis would change back and forth a couple of times from bipolar to schizophrenic, but it's schizophrenia. This I prefaced before going back to my father to make it make more sense as to why she was having such a troubled childhood and how she ended up in such a dynamic to where she would end up with somebody so much older than her at such a young age. She was hanging out with partiers. She had already been to a psych ward, and she'd already had some pretty traumatic experiences from hanging out with people she shouldn't have been hanging out with, or from her mother leaving her with adults that shouldn't have been trusted. Her mother was, from a childhood, rather neglectful, and it eventually became her father's responsibility to take care of her and to help her through this life, especially without any education. Later in the years, her father would apologize to all of the kids after he'd gotten sober over how he acted as they were kids and all of the horrible things he had done. My mother always loved her father and cherished him highly, and always despised her mother for how she was treated. So now you have two individuals, both from troubled childhoods to an extent, and both that tend to get in trouble. Both of them hate their mothers. Both of them have complicated families. It's not hard to see why they fell in love with each other. From the get-go, things seem okay. My father was apparently a very great man. But the second they got married, it changed. It's almost like all these morals, all these ideas that he held was now gone. It's almost like he decided that now she is his property and he can do as he pleases, but she cannot. And it stayed that way. He cheated on her in their early marriage a lot of times. He kept using drugs, heroin, pills. He had problems with taking care of my sister. Many times my mother would come home after work to find that my sister had been soiled pretty much all day. Her diaper was dirty, she had no food, nothing. My mother found irritation in this, but she wanted to take care of him. She wanted to see him change, and she knew she could get him to change. So she kept at it. A little later, an incident notable to her happened where she came home and she had already known that my father was likely at home with another woman at the time while she was at work. And she decided, I'm going to catch him. So she left in the middle of her workday to come home and see what was up. And she found her daughter, my sister, sitting outside next to a tree all alone. And my sister would have been about maybe 4 or 5 at this time, just plain locked out of the house. When my mother got to the door, she obviously unlocked the door, stepped in, and asked my father what is going on. My sister had just told her that she's seen this different lady leave not too long before she got home. So my mother already knew what was going on. My father said, oh, she's just outside playing. I'm in here enjoying some alone time. She knew that's a lie. She called him out on it. And instead of having an argument, my father then proceeded to walk outside and scream in my sister's face that if you ever tell her anything like that again, I will make you regret it. So concluded that interaction. And so preluded the interactions that my father would continue to have and how he would continue to structure his life around him. By this point, my father had no more dreams or aspirations. His only goal was to have a son, and he was determined my mother would be the one to bear it. So, eventually, he convinced my mother to get pregnant again. She didn't want to. She did not want to be with my father, but she loved him, and she couldn't help it. So, begrudgingly, she decided to try. At the time, she was pretty convinced she couldn't get pregnant. She'd had some health complications earlier in life that ended up resulting in most of her uterus being destroyed. So she was pretty confident there was no way she was going to get pregnant anyway. Might as well just humor him and let him try. She was wrong. First time, it was a miscarriage. But second time, it was me. And sure enough, she was pregnant again, and now she was having a son. My father was elated. My mother, not so much. She was like, man, I'm going to have to do this whole baby thing all over again, considering what just happened with my sister. This is going to suck. And suck it did. 6 months into my pregnancy, my father quit his job and told my mother he's never working again. She kind of thought he was just joking, but he wasn't. Time passed, and as time passed, he still never got a job. In fact, he kept trying to hunt for different doctors to give him reasons to get disability, and he would eventually find one to give him that wish. He never worked a day in his life that I was alive, and it was very strange because it did fester into even more problems. She can recall that after he stopped work, then more problems began rapidly, because now every single dime she earned, he spent towards drugs and alcohol. And during her entire pregnancy, he stayed messed up the entire time. Anyway, once I was born, my mother had, after many, many begs from her father, decided it probably would be best to leave my father. One day, she told him, I've had enough. I'm done. You haven't changed. You stay high all the time, and you're violent. I can't trust you with my children. I'm leaving. This is all it took to set off the motion of a fear that she would then forever have. After a rather tense altercation, my mother managed to get her stuff packed up. She grabbed my sister and said, we're leaving. And as she grabbed me, my father came in, yanked me out of her arms, and said, you can leave, but you will never take your son with you. I do know from later speaking with my father, that is because his whole life goal was to have a son, and for him, I was that prized possession. I would not be going anywhere, and that I would stay with him. My mother kept telling him, let go, like, give him back. He's my child. You can't do this. But my father was insistent that he would just go to a court and tell them about her schizophrenia and tell them that she is not mentally fit to have children and that he would indeed be able to maintain custody. And my mother did believe him. My mother was more than convinced that that would happen if she did try to leave. So she stayed. Many, many, many times throughout my early childhood, this sequence of events would take place where she would leave, she would try to leave, find the threat of what would happen to us if she were to leave. A notable experience I can now get into is my own recollection of events of my father. From very early childhood, I remember my father being incredibly violent towards me and my sister. He would constantly be in this altered state. And of course, as a kid, I didn't understand what was going on, but I do now know it was drug use. But as he would be in this altered state, he grew incredibly violent towards us. And more often than not, we would get severely punished, typically physically, for incidents that we had no clue what he was talking about. We do now later know he was likely just hallucinating in his drug-induced state. But for him, it seemed real, and he would punish us for it. Multiple times throughout early childhood, me and my sister were both punished for things that, never happened, or for very minor infractions, things that any normal kid would do. Accidentally breaking a toy, we would be punished mutually. From very early childhood, it was instilled in me that I was not allowed to cry. He made it very well known that men do not cry and you are not allowed to cry. And multiple times throughout my childhood, if I did cry, he would let me know that if I continued, he would be fixing it. With, of course, threat of force. As a young kid, I believed him. I had no way to defend myself. My mother was incapable of defending us, at least not without having to do some horrible thing to him in front of us, and that's the last thing she'd want. Even harmless little jokes or pranks my mother would try to pull on him would result in punishment towards us to punish her for doing these things. If my mother wasn't around, you could guarantee he was on drugs or off with another woman. When my mother did work, when she was allowed to work, it was torturous. My father still had no job. He'd finally gotten disability, but he would blow every single dime of not only his money, but her money on things that we didn't need. We're talking computers, TVs, food, and not actual nutritious food, just fast food, pizza, Burger King. He would blow it on little tools and toys for him to play with. He'd blow it on substances, alcohol. And in trade, my mother would have to work more and more and more hours just trying to keep us afloat and trying to maintain rent. Eventually, we would move out of our old location into a new town in rural Indiana, where my father forced her to stay awake to continue getting the move done while he slept and stayed high during the move. Multiple times she fell asleep behind the wheel. And I do remember a time when we were going to the new location in the middle of the night, and I woke up, and all of a sudden there is a really big tree coming really quickly at us. And I scream out like, whoa, tree. And my mother wakes up and yanks the wheel to hurry up and stay back on the road. And thank goodness I screamed at that very moment, because tree was coming super quickly. She admitted she'd fell asleep, that she'd been sleep deprived, and later I would find out that during that time my father had refused to let her sleep, so in trade she'd been awake about 3 days with only little bits of naps scattered in. It was dangerous, and this disregard for her well-being would be a continuing pattern moving forward. My mother, when I was young, got very, very sick. She ended up having a lot of problems medically, again, with her uterus. And she's had recurring problems medically with her uterus and her kidney failing and things along these lines. When she'd gotten very sick, she had became practically bedridden, where now we had to take care of ourselves, which mainly was me and my sister, because my father was asleep 24/7. We weren't aware of how bad her medical state was, but he was. And he would not take her to a hospital. He refused to. She could lay there and die for all he cared. My mother, thankfully, had her father still around at the time, who finally came and said, "We're going to a hospital." And he even tried to talk my father into going. My father shared no interest. He just kept repeating, "She's fine. She don't even need a doctor. She'll be okay." Well, after going there, it was revealed that she was in very serious condition. She had to take a short hospital stay where they finally got her stable enough to go back home to take care of the kids, of course. But she was in a very bad state when she had arrived at the hospital that night. And they had said that she likely would have been dead within the week had she not come to the hospital. My father did not care. My father showed no interest. Time would pass, and again, violence would spread. We had observed our father hurting our mother physically. We had gotten to repeatedly be a part of and witness the horrible mental manipulation that my father would use against her. To deep resentment from me, as I was the only other man of the household, and I was now getting to the age, this is about middle school time, to where rebellious was an understatement. All my life up to that point, I had been bullied because of how weird I was. And in fairness, that's because my home life was so stressful that, yeah, I was a weird kid. Getting into middle school, that changed. Suddenly I was defiant. Suddenly I was mad at the world. My grades started plummeting. I became the school bully myself. I found anybody I could to pick on, just to make up for all the picking on I had at home. I stayed in my room 24/7. I did not come out if I was home. And more importantly, my father no longer scared me. He was starting to get bigger in terms of weight, and his health was slowly declining due to all the drug use. So he was no longer a real physical threat. I'm sure if he tried, he could still inflict some damage, but in the end, he didn't have the endurance needed to keep up with him, and I knew it. This is when things got even more complicated. Now that I was in a defiant phase, my mother's father, my grandfather, had passed away. My uncle and her brother had passed away. One of them. And the other one was now so ridden in drugs that he was no longer capable of helping to defend her. I was her defense. She again got sick, and again I had to go to the store with her multiple times to help take care of her. She had to use one of those little mobility scooters. I guess they're primitive compared to now, but it was a mobility scooter. She relied on me heavily a lot of times, both emotionally and physically, to support her and try to keep my father at bay from the things that he would do. I recall repeatedly a power move he would use on us as pets. He would get us pets for Christmas and stuff, and my mother would convince him to let us have pets, only for him to then decide, once we ticked him off too much, or once he was just done hearing the animal, that it's time to get rid of them. So he would take them out to the woods and abandon them. He did this regardless of what animal it was. Cat, dog, it didn't matter what we had. If it was annoying to him, or if we annoyed him, out to the woods it would go. And he would make sure it was far enough away from home that the animal would never find its way back. Of course, this would be an almost certain death sentence for most of them. And me being a little kid, I didn't really know that. But yeah, if I cried, I would be punished. So I wasn't allowed to cry. I would just have to sit in the vehicle with him, holding the animal, knowing that in about 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to have to let go of the animal one last time and see it in the distance as we drive away, knowing the animal would never return. I always hated my father for this. This was the one thing that, of all the abuse he would do to us, that truly stuck with me, because it personified his embodiment of objectification of anything around him. People, animals, especially women, were objects to him, and he did not care what happened. It was not his problem. The animals would often receive no medical treatment. If there was something wrong with the animal, because we never had enough money since he used it all, well, it would just get put down. And that was his job. He would take the animal out there and do what you do. It sucked. It really hurt. I would see these friends of mine with pets that they'd had for years, and I could not relate. Because for me, all the pets we ever have would vanish the second that any trouble came up. My mother eventually got tired of things and would decide to leave my father for the first time. This was a really hard time for all of us. I was just entering middle school, and my sister was just entering later into high school. Because of this, the family then got split. My sister, and I don't blame her, had decided to stay with my mother. Me, I decided to stay with my father. For me, it was beneficial. My father wanted to please me. For him, I was the only person he really cared about. And despite his abuses towards me, his abuse towards me was less than what he would do to my mother and my sister. So I always felt special And of course, I cherished it. He would let me do anything I want, say anything I want. He pretty much let me have the teenager's dream. So, of course, I stayed with him. Internally, not only was it of benefit, but it also came down to I didn't want to see him alone. I knew that he was a very disliked person. Of course, by this time, all the truths about his past had already came to surface, not only for my mother, but for us. We knew he had had another family before us. We knew he did the other family the exact same way as us. We knew that everybody he came to paths with typically left with a very bad experience. I stayed with my father during the first separation, and my mother would eventually come back. My mother left and came back multiple times throughout the rest of my childhood, and this was because of the turmoil that was inside of their relationship. My mother had finally grown so tired of his antics, so tired of him and how he treated all of us, that she just could not stand to be there. But her duty as a mother to want to be there for us all the time and take care of us also kept her coming back. As I got older, I was able to take care of myself a lot better. So he was no longer a threat to me physically. He would instead find ways mentally to screw with me. This could be from limiting my internet because I ticked him off, or going out and convincing me that we could go do these things together that would be fun, only to then not show up and not participate. Typically, he would just end up taking so many pills that he would just pass out. This isn't to say that this wasn't without its consequences on him, too. There was multiple times where major incidents unfolded. A good example is my mother had tried to kill him twice throughout my childhood. The first time, I believe, was before I was born, and she had crunched up a whole lot of his pain pills into what she figured would be a lethal dose and put it in his drink and served it to him. He passed out, and she was convinced when she wakes up in the morning, he would be gone. Well, because he was already a horrible drug addict and it was well known, nobody would bat an eye at his sudden departure from an overdose. So it would have been fine. She woke up, and he was just fine. He was just sitting there watching TV. Just fine. He'd survived it. She was, of course, just in bafflement. How did this man just survive? How many pills I put into that drink? He has to be doing more than just these pills. There has to be more drugs in that system right there than what any man should have in his system. She tried again. I do believe it was during a later separation when she finally grew tired of him pulling the antics he was pulling to try to manipulate her. He wanted free of her, or she wanted free of him, and she was going to try again. She tried the same method twice, and this time she made sure to put even more to get the job done. Same thing happened. She did it. He passed out. She thought, he's done for. By morning, I can call the police. He overdosed. Wakes up in the morning, and he is back to watching TV just fine. Obviously, my father would have had to have known this happened. You don't just accidentally take an extreme amount of drugs and not notice that it happened. So it's certain that he knew she probably did something to him. But it didn't change anything. If he did know, he never said it, and that's probably for his own survival, because he knew if he did say it, that it probably doubled down on her wanting to finish the job. It may be illegal to do something like that. You can say what you want morally, but understand all of the torture and all of the horrible manipulation he had done throughout my childhood, throughout my sister's childhood, and throughout the time that my mom had been with him, that none of us really batted an eye at this story. We all kind of agreed Yeah, he probably did need to go down that road. He was a very bad person, and bad people do deserve to sometimes be perished from this world. He was an example of that. There was nothing you could do to help us, minus getting rid of him, because he would stop at nothing to make sure that we would suffer if we crossed paths. He repeatedly manipulated my mother throughout our later childhood, throughout my later childhood, as things would move on. Once my sister got old enough to move out with her boyfriend, and she moved out when she was 18, um, he manipulated her with guilt, more or less saying that, your mother's left me, I have your brother here, and he's so young, and I barely have enough money with disability. If you could just give me some money while you're working, that would be great. And sadly, my sister believed him, and it worked. My sister did it because I was there, and she felt bad for him, despite everything he had put her through. He even refused to attend her graduation from high school simply because my mother had a boyfriend and he could not accept that. So he didn't go. He cut off my sister completely, but still would manipulate her into giving money. My mother had some bad spots at this time too, not only with her schizophrenia, but also because of how long she had been stuck in this routine that when she finally escaped the first time, she decided she wanted to be free and go do all the things she never got to because of him. She got really, really heavy into alcohol again and had another horrible relapse into alcoholism that lasted for quite a bit. It was very unfortunate seeing how she was treating her life, and eventually it got to the point that she herself had become so inhibited all the time that my sister now lived a similar reality where she could go do pretty much whatever she wanted, and my mother couldn't really do anything about it. My mother, of course, would later apologize deeply to both of us for how that happened, and she would explain the logic as to why it happened, but she would repeatedly offer apologies and say that I should have never put you guys through that. We, of course, forgave her. Considering the circumstances around us, what else would have happened? Well, of course you would be in this state. Any logical person would have come to this state because of the abuses that they were being forced to deal with out of threat of losing their children. More manipulation continued as time went on. One of the things he loved to do to get my mother to come back and to get her to have to step in was continually blow all of his money and then have to go to her and say, look, I don't have any money in my account and rent's due. Either you pay or we're now homeless. And you wouldn't want your son like that, would you? And it would work. Of course it would. Having to do it because if she, there would be many worse consequences to pay. Of course, as I got older and his state became more and more physically fragile, it became easier for me to step up and be very combative with him. Multiple times we did have physical altercations between each other, especially regarding my mother, because of how he would speak about her, how he would treat her, and the things he would do to her, both physically and mentally. I became upset. I grew tired of it, and I was very dead set I would get him. What was unfortunate during the times that my mother was back is any time that I went ahead and inserted my defiance against him and showed him I was no longer afraid of him like I was when I was younger, well, it would get taken out on my mother. My mother would receive the consequences of any action I did, and it was kind of the reverse logic of what had happened for so long when she was still trying to take care of us as kids. My mother came back for one final time, and this time for good. She came back, and of course by this time my sister had been long moved out, and told me, I'm staying till you're 18, and you've graduated, then I will leave again, and I will be done with him for good. But I want to make sure you're taken care of while we get you to being an adult, because I don't trust your father alone with you through this phase of your life. I told her okay, and we continued at that. Me and her stayed as a team against him always, and it was a struggle. He would do awful things. I remember always trying to bring pets home. If I would find a stray, I would just want a pet so bad, and I'd bring a stray home. By this time, we had not had animals in a while, because when we moved for the last time, he got rid of every single animal we had, even ones we'd had for a couple years that he didn't get rid of then. He'd get rid of them. He would give them away to his drug friends. Well, I remember trying to bring home these stray animals, hoping I could get a new pet, and inevitably, it would backfire. Every single time, he would physically grab them, and out that door, that animal would go. If we tried to open the door, there would be payment. There would be vengeance struck against us. He would beat at them with whatever he could have in his hand to get the animal to run away from the home and not come back. He would purposely not let us feed or water them or anything else. He was very convinced that he still had the power, and in a very good sense he did. Even though physically we could easily outmaneuver him, mentally he still had us in his grasp, and it showed. Life was hard during this time. My mother continued to work as an act of defiance against him. He held the belief forever that he was the breadwinner of the house, and that was the way it would be, even though he doesn't work and never had since I'd been born. He held the belief that women should be at home, in the kitchen, taking care of the family, and they should not be allowed to work. They should not be allowed to have friends. They should be at home always to take care of you. And he enforced that belief a lot. Multiple times he tried to convince me my mother was cheating on him, which is not true, and I knew that. Multiple times he tried to convince me my mother was incestuous and that my sister was not mine. It was her brother's. I knew this would be false. And, of course, as time continued to go around, he would pull more tricks. A good example during the final separation they had was my mother had came home to cook a Thanksgiving dinner for all of us. And when she did, she had just got done cooking dinner, and of course my father had been seen watching TV the entire time. For some context, my father, my entire life, stayed in his chair. And I mean my entire life. He stayed in his chair. He had horrible diabetes, and his legs were horribly swollen always. They looked like the surface of Mars. His face would stay swollen up, especially towards the end of his life, because he would sleep in his chair. He would not go to a bed. So it would stay poofy. All the blood would pool to one side of his body. It was challenging. Very challenging. Anyway, he of course still maintained heavily into his drugs, and sometimes I would see the consequences of that in his behavior. A funny story about this is there was a day where he was convinced that the things he did while he was high was not true. He did not remember them, and so for him, it just didn't happen, and my mother must be a liar. Well, one day, in his very high state, my mother's sitting on the couch, watching TV, just trying to be silent and keep from aggravating him. And suddenly, she heard him scouring around the bathroom. And she finally stood up and was like, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm in the fridge." She says, "That isn't the fridge." And him says, a line that ain't too nice for YouTube, but another way says, "Go away." Okay? So she said, "Well, fine." So she goes, sits back down. And about the second she sits down, all of a sudden he is coughing his guts up. I mean, he is just dry heaving over and over and over again and goes, "What the fuck?" And she jumps up and hurries and runs back to the bathroom. What? And he had held a bottle of rubbing alcohol and chugged about half of it before realizing he was not in the fridge and this was rubbing alcohol that he was now drinking because apparently he was thirsty. He remembered that one. Of all the things he didn't remember while he was high, he remembered that one. And it was the funniest thing ever to see him do that. It did prove him right for the way he was and for being so refusing of the idea that he would get up when he was high and do stupid, weird things. It was very funny. Anyway, once my mother came back for the last time, the deal was she would stay until I had graduated. Eventually, I was 17, and this is where things take kind of a dark turn. I'd had my first significant bout of depression. It can be assumed that this was likely the beginning of the complications of my bipolar disorder, but of course at that time we had no major warning signs outside of my journal. I can't recall much about how this felt, but I do remember that I had entered this horrible depressive state, and in my journal I kept from back then, I had wrote repeatedly about these voices that were telling me to do these bad things to myself and how, you know, this world can't continue on and how I cannot live here anymore. Eventually, I would try in 2018 in July to conclude. Hopefully, my friends seen all the warning signs, known that something was wrong. Thankfully, I sent one last ominous text to my best friend at the time, telling him sorry to me immediately. He managed to get a hold of the local police station and get them my way. I had attempted to take a copious amount of certain things to achieve my end-of-life goals. When the paramedics got there and the police practically busted down the door, I already knew they were there for me. And I was embarrassed because now I knew my family would have to know that my mental state was in a horrible place. What was particularly frustrating for me and for those around me was I could not explain why I was in this mental state. It's just, I was. But this would act as a prelude. Eventually, once I was in the hospital, my father stayed for only about 30 minutes before complaining he was bored and went home to watch TV. This was a final straw for me. For some reason, out of all of my life events so far and all of the horrible things he'd done to me, this little token was finally it, and I was done. I came to the point that I was like, surely now he will understand that what he's doing is hurting me. But he didn't. He just left. And I was done. My mother stayed with me the entire time. When we came back, my mother confiscated anything in the house that could possibly hurt me and kept tabs on me every single day, making sure that I was okay. My father never mentioned it once, and he, beyond sometimes asking, "How are you doing?" never said anything. Never showed concern. A few months would pass of unsuccessful therapy because nobody could figure out why I was depressed, and I didn't know either. At the time, I was just diagnosed with moderately severe depression, and they humored the idea of maybe it's some sort of depressive disorder. So, it was put on the back burner and we'd worry about it if it came up again. My father and mother were fighting a lot. Less than when I was a kid, because my mother had learned if she just sat silently, he would be quiet and leave her alone, usually. But it still was rough, and we were fighting a lot. Eventually, I looked at my mother and told her that, well, hold on. My mother had gotten really sick again. I forget for what. I believe it was a cyst that was in her uterus, again, with all of the uterus problems. She was on the line of kidney failure again, and they were concerned that it was cancer. We were still waiting for the test results when an incident unfolded that was almost so wrong it was humorous. Shortly before this little incident, my father and mother had a big fight over some cake. Believe it or not, cake. Or it was pie probably, I wanted to go to this local fair and get some pie or cake or whatever it was, and he adamantly refused to let me go, saying I was being punished for being annoying. My mother took my side. We were always a team. And she said, screw you then. I'll just take him to Walmart and buy one anyway. Fine, he won't go to the fair. Strict to your rules. But he's still getting a freaking cake. So she took what last money she had, and as we walked out the door, they were both screaming, and he screamed out, I never loved you anyway. And she had a very violent response for that one. She whipped around and she let him know what she thought of that statement. We sat in the car for a while after buying that cake and just talked. And talked and talked. And I eventually told her in that time, I said, Mother, if you want to go, if you want to leave, you can. I understand why. And I'm old enough now. I'm getting ready to turn 18. I'm getting ready to graduate high school because I graduate midterm anyway. So it ain't going to affect me any. You know, we get through the rest of Christmas here and it doesn't really matter. By this time next year, I'll be in college anyway. Who cares? And it ain't like I'm going to hate you for it. You've fulfilled your promise to me, and you did a dang good job at it. And we've gotten through the rest of this hellhole of him together. And she said, okay. She wasn't going to leave him yet. But later that following week or around that same time span, with her sickness progressing, my mother was on the phone with her grandmother. Now, later in life, when I was still younger, my mother had finally welcomed her mom back into our life and had more or less decided that since her father had passed, it might be time to try to forgive her for the horrible things that her mother put her through as a kid. They still fight a lot about their past, but they do talk now on a regular basis, and they do share a okay relationship. They were talking, and my father stood up. He was in the kitchen cooking food, and randomly he decided to look over at her and say, I hope they don't get you better. At first, she just sat silently, and my grandmother was like, did I just hear that? And she said, I don't know. And she looked at him and said, what'd you say? And he said it again with confidence in a very calm voice. He wasn't angry or anything like that. Just reaffirmed that he hoped she couldn't get better. And of course, she was just shocked. She was stunned. Never, despite all the horrible things he had done to her, did she think he would say that line, especially when it was a real threat of what could be the current circumstance. She said, why? Why do you hope they don't get me better? And he explained that if she dies, then he gets money out of it, and he gets custody over us, and, then she's out of the picture. No longer is he going to have all these problems because of her. That she was the problem, and it would have been a simple solution. And it would have been a solution that we could all live with. She was stunned, to say the least. She was just in shock that he would even say this or think this. And of course, she tried to explain to him that I don't have any life insurance. I don't have anything that you'd be able to get. I don't even got money. What do you think you're going to get? I didn't think you're going to owe fees if I'm dead. And he didn't believe that. He never believed that. But she said, it's okay. You'll be the one to go before me. And thankfully, the diagnosis was that it was just a cyst. It was not cancerous, and that she would be okay once it was removed and that her symptoms would subside. But it was shortly after that she did go ahead and leave him that last time and said, that she was done, that she would never come back, and that she would always be there for us, but he could go rot. I was again left alone with my father, and I wanted to stay. I wanted to help take care of him because I didn't want to see him die alone, despite all the things he would do. When it was just me and him throughout history, as I've said before, he treated me wonderfully. For the most part, he wasn't abusive. For the most part, he was just a normal father, maybe lacking in care in the departments he should be lacking, but he did make sure I maintained at least some academic standards, and he made sure I didn't get in too much trouble. He was a rather just normal father when there was no one else around. Though through our conversations privately, he would reveal that this was mainly because I was his prized possession, and that he had always wanted a son, and because I am his son, that's all he cares about. That's the only thing in this world he cares about is me. Well, anyway, so she's left again, and I'm now alone with him. I graduated high school, started my first job, left that job and went to my second job because it sucked, and the second job sucked too. But at my second job, I was about 2 weeks in, and my father said, "Look, I want to go back and get my surgery for getting this pump replaced. I finally got it approved." He had a spinal pump for pretty much all my life that dripped morphine into his spine. He had crushed discs from his very sedentary lifestyle. And when I mean sedentary, as I said, I ain't joking when I say he literally never left the chair. So it was sedentary. And his spine reflected the issues that came from that. Now, he did grossly exaggerate the pain he was in to doctors to get that spinal drip in the first place. But what he would do is he would take a needle, and when he found the injection port to his spinal drip, and he would push it in, take out the morphine, and shoot it up to get high off of. And he would inevitably go to doctors complaining that his pump's broken, just for them to cut him open, realize what he had done, refill it, and then set the dosage back all the way to minimum. And he would go through the whole process again of trying to find a new doctor who would believe his story or who was a shady character. There was more than once I would get to see his doctors on TV, on the news, for getting arrested for writing false prescriptions or doing horrible things to patients. And it showed what kind of doctors he tried to work with to get what he wanted. Well, he had once again convinced an unassuming doctor that his pump was broken and he should get a new one of the more modern ones that have a clicky button to let you kind of dose up on morphine when you wanted to. He, of course, wanted to use that for abuse, but he convinced his doctors that he'd had this pump for a long time and that it just made sense. The doctors believed him in thinking that the pump must be broken, and the insurance agreed to replace it. So, he was scheduled for the surgery. He wanted me to take days off work to take him there. He did not have a license. He hadn't had a license the entire time that I was alive, or that I've been alive, because he had gotten into so many drug-induced accidents when I was yet to be born that they stripped him away of his license permanently. And of course, he would drive anyway and get into more accidents and get in even more trouble. He went to jail a couple of times for a few days because of these really stupid instances. Well, he convinced me, and since I was the one still learning to drive and trying to get my license, I was like, yeah, it'd give me time to get behind the wheel. I might as well. Before this day happened, we were out doing a practice drive, and something kind of interesting happened. Now, keep in mind, just about 6 months prior to this day, I had the incident that I told you about in 2018. So it's now 2019, and we're doing a practice drive, and he looks at me and he says, "I want to tell you something." And I said, "What?" And in a very calm, serious tone, he told me, "I'm having very bad thoughts, very bad ideations, and I don't know what's going to come of it." And I just kind of giggled. Out of all the things he says and does, this is nothing out of the norm for him, especially since I'm already assuming he's now trying to butter me up to give him money, because why is he saying this otherwise? Now, admittedly, it was out of the norm. He'd never said this specific line before in the way that he said it, but I simply laughed it off and pretty much told him, well, I can tell you from my own experience that it sure didn't make anything else better around me. So I didn't think much of it. He blew me off during my incident. He showed no care, so why would I show care in return? This is the man that's put me through a lot of trauma, put his family through a lot of trauma, and the family before him, before us, through a lot of trauma. Why would I care about what his feelings are? Anyway, the surgery takes place and I'm there. My mother is the one that has to come pick me up that day, of course. But I'm excited because I get to home alone for a little bit. At the time, I was into live streaming and I loved it. It was so exciting. I'm 18. I get to be home alone. I just got this VR headset, the CV1, the Oculus CV1, this new cutting edge technology. And I'm so excited to have time alone to just kind of spoil myself, and not have to work and just take care of the house and play these video games all day and all night. I remember I took a picture of his empty hospital bed when he went to use the bathroom real quick, mainly just because I thought it was cool, but there's some foreshadowing here. The surgery failed because the doctors opened him up, only to then realize his pump had been drained through the port and what that meant. And then they realized he was just here trying to get a fix. So, again, they turned the pump down to minimum, refilled it, and then prescribed him the minimum amount of painkillers possible. He was withdrawing bad by this point. When he was released, my mother had pre-warned me. She pre-warned me when she dropped him off that he's heavily withdrawing right now. If anything happens, just tell me. Well, he did nothing but sleep. So when I woke up in the morning to get ready for work, I gave him a hug. I could tell he felt really bad from withdrawal, and he could barely speak. But I gave him a hug, said, "I love you. I'll see you after work." And he said, "Yeah, I'll see you." And that was it. I went to work, and it was around lunchtime, and I'd had a really good weekend. It was nice getting away from everybody for a bit, having the place to myself for a bit. And I started fantasizing about, life could be that way. If I keep at this job, if I get the money, I could go live on my own and finally start my own life away from all of this trauma. But life had other plans. My mother picked me up, dropped me off. She already knew my father was withdrawing, and her being there was going to be bad. So she let me step out of the car, and off she went. And I told her, "I love you. I'll see you tomorrow when you come pick me up again." She said, "All right." And of course, she reminded me, if anything happens, just call. Off she goes. And I turn around, I walk into my apartment, and I expect him to be passed out, because I almost guarantee he's either in a lot of pain, or if he's not passed out, he's probably still going to be so weak sitting there that he's not even going to acknowledge my existence. I step in and look to the right, and the scene before me was gruesome. He was slumped over. He was on his knees on the floor, slumped over onto the couch. His sandals that he never ever took off was flung across the room. Every single prescription bottle he'd ever had was lined out on the table. There was the divorce papers that he refused to sign sitting out on the table. We all assumed he'd already threw those away, but there they were. And there was a weapon, a revolver, sitting behind him. I stared, and I didn't know what to think. I had initially presumed it's likely he took all those pills and he's probably really high right now. And I don't know what his intentions are with that firearm, but considering his history, I need to get between him and the firearm ASAP. So I sprinted to my room to drop off all the stuff I was holding in my hands, came back in the living room to hurry up and get myself between him and the weapon. I pulled the weapon back behind me and then stood between it, and then tried to wake him up. That is when I noticed there was blood splattered to the left of him, and he was ice cold to the touch. I knew what happened. I knew what he did. And it was an unfortunate reality that was now suddenly upon me. I called my mother to tell her that something has happened. You need to grab my sister and come here right now. Uh, and she said, okay. I left it at that. And then afterwards, I called the police, told them what had happened, and what I've just walked into. When the police got there, of course, they peeped their head in real quick just to confirm my story and was talking with me when suddenly my sister is sprinting dead sprint towards me. My sister lived right down the road. So apparently my mother had called her and said, something's happened to your father, you need to get to the apartment right now. That was not my instructions, woman. That was not any part of my instructions. I believe I told you to pick her up and not say anything and get here. Screw me and my instructions, right? So my sister is now dead sprinting, and she has asthma anyway, so her dead sprinting is impressive, and she's pretty small, so it's almost humorous too. She's almost like a penguin sprinting. All right, anyway, sorry, I'm being mean, but she was dead sprinting towards me, and I was like, oh, great. And the officer looked over, was like, who's that? And I'm like, that's my sister, and I guess I need to talk to her now. It's not to say I wasn't an emotional wreck, but I have a tendency, obviously, to not cry. And so, besides the initial burst of tears, I was not crying at that very moment. I was just pacing back and forth for a lot of it, and my tears had already well dried up. Well, she's dead sprinting, and she, of course, sees all of the police and ambulance and all of these lights all lined up at our apartment, and knows something bad must have happened. She comes up, and I hug her, and she's like, what's going on? And I told her, I'm sorry, but Dad is dead. And she crumbles. She just crumbles into a sobbing mess at this news. Who wouldn't? You know? And she's absolutely in a just horrible state. Well, I sit with her trying to get her to calm down her breathing, and, you know, she asked me what happened to him, and I didn't tell her. I said, don't worry about it right now. Let's just worry about that later. And then my mother showed up. At this point, my mother had already called her extended family and said that something's happened to him, and I believe he's gone. But she showed up with her boyfriend at the time, and the police officer there said, who's that one? And I said, that would be my mother. I guess I'll go talk to her. And he said, no, because they're still married technically, right? And I said, yeah, they were just separated. He said, all right, then in that case, I'll be the one to do this. You just stay with your sister. And I appreciate he did that, because I don't feel like my sister should have been alone at that time. And I didn't know what I was going to say to her. I was dreading having to tell her, because I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't know if I had the heart to tell her what happened. But the police officer did walk up and tell her everything that happened and what they have concluded from looking at the scene, and had confirmed to her that her husband had indeed committed the unthinkable. She was distraught, but in kind of the same way of like, my kids are distraught, so now I'm distraught. You know, obviously with our history, it was a complicated mix of emotions at this. She walked up and asked if I was okay. I said, yeah, just here, sit with my sister. And she sat down with my sister to kind of calm her down a bit more. And then, of course, doing what my mother does best, she decided to then, my sister asked her what happened. You know, he didn't tell me what happened to him. And I maintained she doesn't need to know. My mother did not maintain that and told her exactly what had took place today. And again, now my sister was a crumpled mess. And I was like, thanks, Mom. You know, I just spent all this time calming her down, and I'm refusing to tell her what happened because it ain't important right now. That can be a conversation for later. And you just ruined it. You told her anyway. But anyway, I'm just pacing back and forth silently, looking at the ground. The police and my family are asking me over and over again, are you okay? Please sit down. Just sit down. And I'm like, nope, I'm fine. Leave me alone. I'm just going to keep pacing back and forth here. This is what I need to do right now. This is how I'm de-stressing. And they said, all right, we'll leave you alone. Eventually came time for them to escort my father's remains away from the property, and they had us all walk to the side of the apartment so we wouldn't see. and escort him away. And that concluded that. Very tied up in having to deal with my sister, who was now in a horrible emotional state, and having to now understand that suddenly, because they're still technically married, she has to take care of all these arrangements of what to do with him. That night, I was going to sleep at her place, and I looked at her and said, I can't sleep here. Can I please go back to the apartment? I want to sleep at the apartment. And she said, are you sure? Because, the mess was still there. Nothing was cleaned up. And I said, yeah, I'm sure. That's where all my stuff is. That's where I've been, pretty much my entire life now. I want to be there. We headed back to the apartment. She made me agree that we would go first thing in the morning, but I was going to sleep there. I barely slept. But we went back to the apartment in the morning, and I stayed there while they sat down on the couch. The blood was still there on the floor, and my sister just couldn't do it. She came unglued again, and she was losing her mind trying to sit there and just talk. She couldn't do it. My mother said, look, I can't keep her here. She's not handling this very well. Are you sure you're going to be okay here alone? I said, yes, I promise I am. I just need this time here. I need to be here. And so she left, and I proceeded to stay on VR and play games on there and talk to friends. And, that was my escape from the realities of what was going on. That was a horribly stressful time for me. And it was an unfortunate demise of my father. Despite everything he put me through, despite everything he put us through, he was still my father, and I loved him. I never, ever, ever wanted to see that reality, not without it being from my own hands. I never wanted to see him take that route, that road, and then suddenly all this foreshadowing of coming up to this day of the things he would talk about made his behaviors, his actions. He had worried, he'd been contemplating this for a while. I do firmly believe he did this because he knew I wanted not much more to do with him once I was gone, and he knew he was now facing loneliness. He's already middle-aged, and he was in really bad health, and there was no way he was going to be able to do anything else with his life. So he would meet another person and have another family, and he knew this family was finally over. That all of these years of abuse and neglect towards us had finally come to a head, and in the end, it was karma that finally got. To say he got what he deserved is an understatement. It's very ironic that he was the one to be his own demise, and it's almost poetic in a way, because it took any chance of ever amending that relationship with anybody away. It took any chance of ever getting the resolution, the peace of mind of resolving these horrible childhood traumas. And it made it to where now everything that happened in my life was set in stone. And he was now gone out of the picture. I've been at this over an hour now, but that is the story of my father. The consequences of what he did, the consequences of that day, still play true in my life. But thankfully, I've now been about 5 months sober from pills myself and from drinking heavily. And I'm doing a lot better in my life than I used to. It took a lot of years. I'm 24 now. It took a lot of years to get over what he did that day and all the pain he put us through. Not all of us are over it yet. While I took his untimely ending as kind of the one true merciful thing he could have done for us, the others just never agreed. My mother still refuses to believe that it was on purpose. She's always convinced herself, because he took every single pill that he had lined up on the table, that he must have done it by accident, that it was not meant for him, and that he accidentally put it to his head and did what he did. Or maybe he was looking down the barrel and, she refuses to believe the truth on it. And the only reason I know it's the truth is because I was there. I had seen the scene, and I knew this was on purpose, that there was no way he ended up in that position with his stuff scattered about, with the things aligned the way they were, without that being a purposeful act. That's not to say he'd always contemplated it. It's very possible he took those pills to try to get high, and then the idea came to him while in that state. He never left a note, is why I do suspect that could be a possibility. And for him, it did surprise me he wouldn't leave a note. But we will never know. With him not leaving any note or any last words behind of his life, we will never know truly the reasons he did it, or what mindset he was in when he did it, or anything like that. We won't know if he counted it as mercy on us, or if he was just so overwhelmed with the situation that he now faced that he could no longer live on. We won't know. My sister always has held a strong animosity towards him, and pretty much never forgave him for the sins that he committed when we were growing up. So, at my father's passing, she never really talked about it, but anytime it's ever brought up, she's always said it was probably for the best. I'm pretty much the only person who doesn't share the agreement that it was for the best. While logically I do agree on paper, it was merciful for us, and it was what was needed. Emotionally, I just can't agree with that. I could never say that to my family, because he was my father, and I loved him. Anyway, I do hope you enjoyed the story. I'm sorry that it was so depressing, but it's just a story that I never really share with anybody, and so I thought once and for all, I would put a piece out there of myself that I never show anybody, just as a way in the future to reflect back on him and to remember some of these stories, and to remember how it was growing up, in the reasons that I got to where I was. Sometimes I have a very hard time articulating why it is that I did all the things that I did, and why I had such a drug issue. Sometimes it feels unfair that I have bipolar disorder, in that I'm stuck in this circumstance in my head of constant cycling and just these horrible dark thoughts paired with these amazing godly thoughts, and sometimes life feels unfair. But then it helps to have this story linger around, to be able to say that, remember what life was like before your problems now. Remember that now the problems pale in comparison to what you already dealt with in the situation that you faced in the end. Remember that it could have always have been worse. And to think that the reality I could be living in with him still around could be much worse than the reality I live in now. It was a complicated life. There's a lot of stories I couldn't share on here. More serious stories about the abuses and neglects of him, and the things he did to my mother, subjected her to, the things he did to us. But those are stories I can't share. And in fairness, I don't really think they're anybody else's business. I've shared enough to convey the point. I do hope if anybody else out there is in a similar situation, or has faced a similar situation, that they can take solace in knowing they're not alone, in that in the modern day, there is still people that are like that and have a horrible raising up because of it. I've never blamed my mother once, because it wasn't her fault for how he was. She tried everything, and she was stuck, held prisoner by him. And I accept that, and I know it wasn't her fault. You can look back and say that, oh, if she was a good mother, she should have left anyway, but understand that her fear from having schizophrenia and what that could mean in court was the reason she couldn't. She'd been diagnosed multiple times in history. She'd went to a psych ward in the past. He had leverage, and she knew that. And that same fear lives along with me. It does suck that I have this problem. It does suck that I deal with this problem, because I know it puts me at a disadvantage in certain circumstances, especially if trying to prove mental capacity in the court of law. And I do hope it's stories like these, in times like these, that I can document. My microphone died. I guess that's a sign for me to shut up. Anyway, thank you so much for watching and listening. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'll try to share what I can. But thanks for listening, and I hope you have a good rest of your night. Sorry the story was so long.